It's a sad day for the council residents. It's a sad day for a lot of people who work hard in the council, and it's a sad day for local government.
I guess the question from the people is how? How did it get to this point? How could someone not have realised what was happening?
I have to point you to my report. It spends 10 pages getting to that point and outlining that. But in short, there was a failure of a CEO and CFO to do their job, and there was a failure of elected representatives, particularly towards the end of the budget, careering out of control to do their job.
You've said that the CFO and CEO were aware of the use of restricted funds that were used to fund a range of overspent projects, and that they continue to use these restricted funds. Can any action be taken against these other than?
I think it's very unlikely. There is provisions under the Local Government Act for surcharging individuals, but they've never been used, and I think that's because they're cumbersome and probably not worth the effort.
You mentioned that the debt will include repaying the restricted funds.
They'll have to be returned, yes.
So that's $200 million?
Yes.
Can you describe the road to recovery from here? To the average person, they hear these huge figures. I mean, how hard is this road going to be?
The report identifies the key levers. There will need to be a rate increase. But as I mentioned, a 10% rate increase delivers $17 million. It's probably worth pointing out that last year's IPART decision saw a reduction in water rates of 39 million. I'm not saying, though, that some people won't find it hard to pay extra rates. There will have to be a substantial reduction in the cost of running the business. I think most people will be shocked when they realise that since merger, there are 242 extra full-time equivalents people working here. Most organisations that merge find an opportunity to reduce the number of people who work in it.
Some would argue that because of the size of the Central Coast that more staff perhaps in some areas may be needed just because we are such a big region rather than small country towns merging. What's your response to that?
They weren't small country towns that merged, but there is often a case to acknowledge that increased population can bring about a need for some increase in staff. But in this case, I don't think that was appropriate. This was expanding services into areas that would be good to have, nice to have, economic development stuff, but without paying enough attention to whether it could be afforded.
Many people do point the finger at the amalgamation, and obviously it's a political issue as well. Labor state members never supported the merger, and Labor councillors weren't fully in favour of the merger. Do you say once and for all now that the merger is not responsible for this financial crisis?
Yes, I've worked in states where Labor governments supported mergers, for example in Queensland when I worked there. I don't see it as intrinsically an ideological question one way or another. But yes, I can say categorically why, and the report deals with this very specifically, so I'll point you to the words that have been well chosen there. There were a whole lot of variables that came into play that weren't recognised appropriately. The extra costs of IT for the merged council were larger than Mr Hart and Mr Ryan, who are very experienced, can believe, but nevertheless they would appear to be real and possibly $40 million above the $10 million provision by the government. And a lot of that's one-off, and there are some, I think it's $8 million or thereabouts, ongoing costs. They themselves aren't what's caused the problem on its own. The other cost increases that are identified there weren't related to the merger. The Gosford Council made an agreement to settle an industrial dispute, which they backpaid 6 years, which was also surprising to me. They may have been required to do that if it had gone to the Industrial Commission. Then the councils merged, and I think Newcastle and Wyong both adopted the same decision and backpaid it. So what might have been a $6 million decision became a $26 million decision, but that's not caused by the merger. The IPART decision wasn't caused by the merger. So there's a whole lot of factors that tipped us down a path of living beyond our means, the key decision, the key misunderstanding was that at merger, they failed to recognise they only had $6 million in the bank. And that's what it gets down to.
So $6 million isn't a lot of money
No.
for a brand new council?
No. Read the report and come back with further questions if you want on that regard.
So the other 60 was restricted funds,
The other,
surplus.
no, there was 40 million of that was grants that year. But they, at some point, people convinced themselves that these large amounts of money in accounts were available, and they weren't. Now, it's very hard retrospectively to nail down exactly who knew what when, but I have come across by searching emails, and some people file their notes in the system. It's clear that there was an awareness, as I said in the report, before, and that didn't stop. But by that stage, it probably couldn't stop. The money was being spent. There were projects underway. So they funded, effectively the council funded a large capital works program that they couldn't afford. And had someone said to them at the time, well, if you want to do that, you'll have to borrow $70 million, they probably would have said, well, most councils don't borrow large amounts of money to do a capital works program unless there's going to be a strong revenue stream attached to them. So their failure to recognise that, I've said I don't blame the councillors for that. I don't think I would have discovered it under their circumstances. So in my view, it's important that the community understands that a major contributing factor to the problems should not be laid at the feet of the councillors. But there were other issues to do with budget management where I just don't think they met the responsibilities required as a governing body. Part of that's the politics, the politicisation of this council, I think worked against collaboration. So any attempts to get information were seen as point scoring, and that's obviously for you all to reflect upon. And I'm happy to talk further about it another time. I'm also happy to debate anyone who wants to debate any of this.
When we talk about a road to recovery, are we looking at years, decades? You don't know?
I think a 5-year plan might well see us getting back to a point where other than the most urgent projects can start to be considered again.
And when it comes to the councillors, so you prepare your report and the minister decides whether they stay or go?
The Local Government Act has provisions for a minister to consider the performance of a council. If one route is to establish an inquiry, which invariably takes 12 months or so, and then there's response by the council time, and then a dismissal can occur then. In fact, in my understanding is all inquiries have been followed by dismissals. In this case, the minister used more recent provisions of the Act, which allows the minister to suspend a council and appoint, and that's why I'm called interim administrator, for 3 months. And the Act also allows for that to be extended for a further 3 months. I've indicated that I will be seeking a further 3 months. I think there's a reasonable chance the minister may agree to that, but that will be her call. That means, though, that my term that might have finished at the end of January will now finish end of April. End of April. So my guess is that it's most likely at that time the elected body will return.
Do you, given the seriousness of the situation, do you think it's realistic that the elected body would return?
I don't. That's not for me to say. There are also provisions of the Local Government Act that allow the minister to appoint a financial controller in these circumstances. And at this stage, it would be hard to imagine that I would not be recommending that.
Given that there's a local government election in September next year, would it perhaps make, I mean, you can't speak on behalf of the Minister for Local Government, but would it make sense to maybe not then bring back a council for a couple of months?
As I explained to you, my reading of the Act and the provisions available to the Minister doesn't allow that to occur. I think the councillors are more than likely to come back, and the imposition of a financial controller will mean that that council can't change the budget that's in place for some time.
But you said you wouldn't recommend that.
Sorry?
Didn't you say you wouldn't recommend
No, I would imagine I would be recommending the placement of a financial controller over the council's affairs. So it becomes like an administrator for money, effectively.
One other term that you used throughout, towards the back end of your address was necessary, not nice. Is that what we kind of have to accept for the coming years in terms of what is going to be delivered by?
Well, I hope people understand that it's necessary. It's certainly not nice, no. I mean, you know, people expect more of their council. They don't expect to see things go from what seemed to be okay to, you know, what I'm calling the greatest financial calamity in the history of local government in New South Wales, possibly Australia. I'm not aware of any council that ever got to this situation, particularly one where they had to go cap in hand to the state government. We can't pay our wages. I mean, this is really serious. It's not just a small hiccup.
Like at the time that they did that, they had the same amount of money, 5 million in unrestricted funds, as they had 3 years earlier. They're in the same position.
Their liquidity ran down because they were using funds. They started to spend the restricted reserves, then they on projects that they couldn't. Then they had to start use other reserves, and they just ran out of cash. And that's astounding. I mean, everyone who runs a business, whether it's a corner shop or not, knows about cash. I mean, the expression cash is king. I mean, it's the fundamental point. And for all those years, I had very good support at councils, particularly Warringah, which Mr. Hart was general manager at, and then the Northern Beaches Council. The financial report would have a whole section on cash reserves and what's happening with cash. It's just astounding.
So how did they not know? How did they not know that externally restricted reserves were understated? How does that happen?
Well, that's my point. There is that the Auditor General didn't pick that up either in their reports. You're getting now to a level of accounting detail that I can't answer. Mr. Hart and Ms. Cowley are available to you if you want to pursue that when you're done with me.
All right, I've got one more question. Why don't we sell the water asset?
I had a prominent businessman put that to me a couple of days ago, and I heard Mr. CEO on the radio before he interviewed me questioning one of the members of Parliament and saying that this had been at different times proposed or discussed by both people on the Labor and Liberal side. That member of Parliament avoided the question. That would be a big debate for the community, and I haven't had a chance to get my head around that, but it may well become an option that the community were interested in. You'd have to be worried about how a council that wasn't able to manage its budget might deal with a huge amount of money coming in like that. But in the past, when these things have been done with major asset sales, sometimes they come with legislation that tie up the funds into some sort of trust that provides a dividend over time to the community. The water business is a good business and it has a profit. So anything you sell, you give up the revenue stream. But yes, it's a very large. It's on our books at around $4 billion, I believe. So it's a very large amount of money. There's no chance that would be sold privately.
We sell part of it.
The question might be whether the state government was interested in acquiring it and linking it with Hunter. I think that would be probably what people have in mind. But I haven't had a chance to get to the bottom of this, so you could ask others, maybe who've been around longer than me.
One last question. I don't see any reference to the Risk and Audit Committee that was set up with great fanfare by the previous administrator. Is there a failure in that?
I went to, in week one, I attended a meeting of the Audit and Risk Committee and I asked them. There was a 15-second silence until the chairman, Dr. Colgalatly, said it's an interesting question. But Mr. Gordon, who's I think probably the most technically competent and experienced member of the committee, took me through their role, and I was satisfied by the end of it that I would delete the reference to them in my list. But I think I will be recommending to the government that they look at the role of those committees and maybe just sharpen it a little bit so the council might have the advantage of that expertise.
Is that a polite way of saying they've been completely useless in this situation?
No. They would properly argue that wasn't their role, as they've got it so.
It's a risk committee, an audit.
Well, I'm not going to answer the question in detail. You can ask Mr Hardy, may have further comment about it, but can I make the bigger point that the Auditor General missed this in 3 audits?
So we might wrap it
Okay,
up there.
they do things like, you know, indicate when there's a problem, they identify problems. So the fact that that wasn't picked up there, and I have talked to the Auditor General, who I think is probably feeling some regrets that maybe they missed something, but she wouldn't give me those words. But I think it was an uncomfortable conversation. But I rang her to advise her that I would be saying that in this report.